The cops had their guns drawn at my 16-year-old son while he was placing flowers on his brother's grave. 1 second, Elijah was kneeling with a trembling hand on the flag-draped box in our garden. The next, a voice barked, "Get on the ground!" and half a dozen officers swarmed in like it was a drug bust. All because our neighbor Karen said a suspicious boy with a shovel and weapon was doing something cult-like on HOA property. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't just some backyard ceremony. It was the burial of my eldest son, a decorated veteran who died overseas. And she certainly didn't know that the woman holding back tears by the roses, the one walking calmly toward the officers, was the United States Attorney General. That was the moment Karen made her last and biggest mistake. It all started 2 weeks earlier when I made the decision to bury my son, Matthew, at home. We owned 5 acres of land that my family had lived on for generations, long before the HOA ever bought up the empty lots around us and built their cookie-cutter empire. Our property had been legally designated as a private burial site decades ago, one of those old Southern rules that Karen either didn't understand or didn't care to research. Matthew's final request was simple: to be laid to rest under the oak tree he used to climb as a boy, with his little brother placing the first flowers. So we followed his wishes, quietly, privately, and with reverence. But to Karen, our grief was a violation of community aesthetics. The morning of the burial, the sky was gray and soft with the kind of light that makes everything feel like it's underwater. Elijah wore Matthew's old scout jacket, sleeves too long and heart too full. We didn't have a big ceremony. Just close family, a chaplain, a folded flag, and an honor song playing low from a speaker. Elijah stepped forward, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers and the dog tags he used to wear around his neck. He knelt down, whispered something, and kissed the wood of the urn. That was when Karen's shriek pierced the quiet. "What is going on here?" she screamed from the edge of her perfectly trimmed lawn, arms crossed and eyebrows so high they nearly hid her hairline. "You can't just bury people wherever you feel like it. This is HOA land." I calmly explained, again, that it was our land, federally registered, and exempt from HOA regulation. She didn't listen. Karen never listened. She saw my grieving son and decided it was a threat to her property value. 15 minutes later, while we stood silently around Matthew's resting place, we saw flashing lights at the edge of the driveway. A swarm of patrol cars pulled up like we were hosting a standoff. My heart dropped when I saw the officers reach for their belts and heard the sharp, terrifying command, "On the ground! Hands where I can see them!" Elijah froze. He looked at me, terrified, hands hovering in the air. I stepped forward, slow and steady, every instinct in me screaming. I'm the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country, but in that moment, I was just a mother watching her only living child being treated like a criminal. I pulled out my badge, the one that hasn't left my side since I took the oath. "I'm Marianne Rivera," I said. "United States Attorney General. Stand down." The lead officer's face went pale like he'd just realized he'd walked into a hurricane wearing flip-flop. Karen, meanwhile, stood in her driveway filming the whole thing on her phone, smirking like she'd just caught someone double parking. When the officers turned toward her, unsure of what to do, she waved and said, "I'll be pressing charges. That boy threatened me with a stick." The stick was a folded flagpole. What happened next was a mix of awkward apologies, nervous shuffling, and Karen shouting that, "This woman is lying. That badge is fake. Anyone can order one online." One of the officers quietly pulled his partner aside and whispered something, probably confirming who I was. In about 30 seconds, the entire tone of the scene shifted. The officers backed off. Elijah sat up, shaking. And Karen, sensing the change, suddenly tried to play innocent. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she chirped. "There are rules, you know." "Yes, there are. And as the chief enforcer of federal law, I planned to use every one of them." Later that afternoon, after making sure Elijah was calm and safe inside the house, I walked down the property line with a camera in hand. Karen had installed new surveillance equipment, 2 cameras pointing directly at our backyard. A blatant violation of privacy law. I documented it, along with the hostile signage she'd nailed to a tree. HOA regulated zone. Trespassers will be fined. She'd already sent us a cease and desist letter, claiming our burial violated community tranquility standards. What she didn't know was that her own HOA was operating under shady financial practices. I'd ignored them, until now. Grief is heavy. It's a weight that doesn't lift, just shift. But injustice? That lights a fire. And Karen had just lit the match. The next day, I called in a quiet favor. Not a public one. Just a low-key request to have a DOJ investigator look into the HOA's financials and charter. Just to see if there were any red flags. I expected to find power-hungry nonsense and misplaced fines. What I didn't expect was wire fraud, elder abuse, and enough violations to fill a legal textbook. The HOA wasn't just run poorly, it was a private little kingdom, and Karen was its unstable queen. And she'd just declared war on the United States government. The morning after the burial debacle, the neighborhood was quieter than usual, like the air itself knew something big had shifted. Karen's lawn ornaments, normally lined up like soldiers, were askew, one flamingo knocked over like it had fainted from the drama. I sipped my coffee on the porch, eyes scanning the street as neighbors passed by just a little faster than normal, pretending they didn't see me. Word had gotten out, not just about Karen's 911 stunt, but about who I really was. A few people gave half-hearted waves. Others ducked behind hedges. I didn't blame them. They were all under Karen's thumb, and for the first time, they realized that thumb might be about to get crushed. Karen, on the other hand, had doubled down. She posted on the HOA forum, accusing me of faking my government position to intimidate hard-working board members, and claiming that Elijah had terrorized the block with military theatrics. I read it 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. She had uploaded blurry photos of Elijah holding the flag, adding dramatic captions like, "Suspicious youth in camo jacket, armed and dangerous?" Someone commented, "Isn't that the Attorney General's son?" And Karen replied, "Not confirmed. Could be crisis actors." That was when I decided she needed a legal wake-up call. I called Royce, one of our quietest but most meticulous DOJ investigators. The man looked like a middle school math teacher, and had the people skills of a houseplant, but give him a spreadsheet and a set of bylaws, and he could dismantle an empire by lunchtime. I didn't give him instructions, just told him, the HOA in Oak Ridge Estates. Start with finances, then poke around. No pressure. He simply nodded and disappeared into his world of coffee, files, and cryptic post-it note. Meanwhile, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. She passed out flyers door to door, wearing a visor and a windbreaker like she was running for office. "Community safety and neighborhood standards are under attack," the flyer read. "Attend to protect our values." When I showed up with Elijah, every head in the room turned like we'd kicked in the door. Karen stood at the front, gripping a wireless mic like a talk show host. Her smile faltered when she saw us, but she pressed on. "Neighbors," she began, voice shaky with fake concern, "we need to talk about the misuse of property for unapproved events." She gestured toward us dramatically. "There was an unauthorized funeral last week, involving flags, weapons, and minors in distress. Our rules clearly state no personal ceremonies without HOA oversight." I raised my hand. "Our property is exempt from HOA governance. It's been on file with the county since 1979. You can look it up." Karen smirked. "Anyone can file something. Doesn't make it legal. You'll need HOA clearance moving forward." That's when Elijah, standing beside me with a folder in hand, opened it and read aloud. "Here's the state exemption for family cemeteries on private land, signed and notarized. And here's the deed showing the HOA was formed 20 years after our property was established." and here's a court ruling confirming that cemeteries, especially military-affiliated ones, fall under federal protections. The room went silent. Someone in the back actually whispered, "Oh wow." Karen turned red, then pivoted hard. "This isn't just about you. It's about everyone. I've received multiple complaints about noise, flags being lowered without permission, and, frankly, the emotional impact on other residents." "Are you suggesting grief should be scheduled?" I asked, voice calm but sharp. Karen blinked, flustered, then attempted to switch tactic. "Let's vote," she said quickly. "All in favor of requiring pre-approval for any ceremonies, including but not limited to burials, memorials, flag displays, and gatherings of more than 4 people, say aye." Only 2 hands went up. Hers and a man who looked like he'd been promised a fruit basket. Karen looked betrayed. "Well, the rest of you clearly don't care about the rules." A voice from the crowd piped up. "We didn't know we could ignore her before." Laughter rippled through the room. After the meeting, Royce called me. "You're going to want to see this," he said. "I'm emailing you some files." The files were explosive. The HOA's operating budget included expenses that made no sense. Catering from high-end restaurants for board lunches, payments to a landscaping company that didn't exist, and random wire transfers to a personal PayPal account listed as community enrichment. Royce had already matched the account to Karen's email address. But that wasn't the worst part. There was a surveillance contract. Karen had hired a private company to install cameras throughout the neighborhood, under the guise of security monitoring. The cameras were hidden in birdhouses, lawn lights, even inside HOA-leased decorative mailboxes. And the footage didn't go to local law enforcement or a neutral party. It went to her laptop. She'd been spying on residents, tracking their routines, recording private conversations on their porches, even zooming in on kids playing in their yard. That crossed a line from entitled to criminal. Royce flagged several legal violations, including unauthorized data collection, child privacy infringements, and misuse of HOA funds. We were no longer talking about Karen being annoying. She was running a suburban surveillance state and using public money to fund her personal paranoia. I didn't act immediately. I wanted her to feel the rope tighten. The next few days were strangely calm. Karen didn't come out of her house much, and when she did, she walked briskly with sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. Word was spreading. Neighbors who once cowered under her clipboard were now meeting in private, trading stories, comparing finds. One woman told me Karen charged her for unauthorized shade because her new umbrella cast a disruptive silhouette on adjacent lots. Another man said his dog was cited for excessive tail wagging. Meanwhile, Elijah was regaining some of his light. He spent hours tending Matthew's resting place, planting flowers and even building a small bench under the oak tree. He didn't talk much about what happened, but his hands were steadier now, and that was enough for me. He'd lost his brother, then almost his dignity. But like the soil around the grave, he was rooting himself again. Karen, however, was unraveling. She posted increasingly unhinged messages on the HOA site about government infiltration, accusing me of planting spies and tampering with property lines. She claimed the flag Elijah placed on Matthew's grave emitted low-frequency noise that disturbed wildlife. At this point, she was trying to file HOA citations against a dead soldier. That's when I knew she wasn't just unhinged. She was dangerous. And the next move was mine. Karen's descent into madness wasn't gradual, it was a nosedive. Just days after her outburst at the emergency HOA meeting, she began issuing printed fines stuffed into people's mailboxes, each more absurd than the last. One neighbor was fined $75 for overly reflective wind chimes. Another got a violation notice for unauthorized laughter after 9 p.m. The community, once held hostage by her clipboard and rulebook, now found itself caught between disbelief and dark humor. Still, there was an undercurrent of fear. As absurd as Karen seemed, she wielded power, and some residents still whispered about the time she had a family's trampoline hauled away for excessive bouncing. But this time, she had picked the wrong target, and the threads of her tiny suburban empire were beginning to fray. Royce called with updates almost daily now, his monotone voice belying the chaos he was uncovering. The private surveillance Karen had installed was far worse than we thought. Hidden microphones were embedded in decorative stones along the neighborhood walking trail. One camera was disguised inside a bird feeder aimed directly into a couple's kitchen window. The footage was being stored on multiple encrypted drives that Royce suspected Karen kept in her attic, away from HOA servers or shared devices. This wasn't just a privacy issue, it was a felony. Unauthorized recording in private spaces, especially involving minors, carried serious consequences. She wasn't watching her neighbors for security. She was monitoring them like an obsessive director in her own personal reality show. The worst revelation came when Royce connected some of the surveillance footage timestamps to financial record. Karen had used data from the cameras to determine when residents were on vacation or out for the day. During those gaps, she would fine them for fabricated violations, often accompanied by faked time-stamped photos. One man had received a warning for leaving his trash bins out too long, even though he was out of town and they were tucked away in his garage. Karen had walked onto his property, pulled the bins out herself, snapped a photo, and then issued the citation. I confronted the police chief of the local precinct, a decent man named Whitaker who looked exhausted when I showed up unannounced. He admitted the department had been receiving Karen's reports for years, but never had enough to go on. "She buries us in paper," he said, rubbing his forehead. "Mostly noise complaints, imaginary fence encroachments, unlicensed holiday decor. We didn't realize she was running her own surveillance grid." I handed him a folder labeled Operation Flamingo. He opened it and stared at the first few pages. His eyes widened. "She's finished," he muttered. But Karen wasn't done fighting. In a move that stunned even me, she sent a cease and desist letter to the Department of Justice. The letter accused the DOJ of harassment, entrapment, and overreach into sovereign community affairs, and demanded a full withdrawal of government presence within HOA territory. She even underlined the phrase sovereign community 3 times. Royce forwarded the scanned letter to me with a subject line that read, "I think she thinks she's a country now." What Karen didn't know was that Royce had already secured a warrant. A quiet, surgical operation was scheduled, nothing flashy, just a tactical extraction of the surveillance equipment, computers, and financial documents that would complete our case. But I had another plan forming, one that wasn't just about removing Karen from power. It was about showing the entire community the extent of her abuse. People had suffered under her rule, lost money, privacy, and in Elijah's case, a piece of innocence. If there was ever a moment for full transparency, this was it. I arranged for the next HOA meeting to be open to the public. Flyers were mailed, posted, and distributed by hand. Word spread quickly. By the time the evening came, the community center was packed wall to wall. Karen stood at the front again, microphone ready, her usual smug expression barely hiding the nervous twitch in her jaw. She launched into her speech about the creeping threat of governmental interference, but I stepped forward and gently took the mic. "Karen," I said, "I think it's time your neighbors see what you've been doing in their name." I turned to the projection screen Royce had set up behind me. The first image appeared. A spreadsheet of HOA funds showing thousands of dollars in unexplained transfers. The room was silent. The second image. A screenshot of surveillance footage, clearly showing a neighbor in their own kitchen, taken without their knowledge. Gasps filled the air. The third image. A list of false citations issued while residents were out of town, paired with screenshots of Karen manipulating their property setup. Karen's face went white. She stammered something about security measures and fake data, but no one was listening anymore. One by one, people stood up, neighbors who'd lived in fear or frustration for years, and began sharing their stories. A woman described how Karen fined her teenage son for overgrown hair visible from the sidewalk. A man said he'd been harassed for owning a red car that clashed with the natural tones of the street. The room, once silent under her rule, became a flood of voices, outrage, and finally, unity. That night, Royce executed the warrant. Federal agents arrived not with flashing lights but with precision and paperwork. Karen's home was searched. Devices were confiscated. Laptops, drives, camera equipment, all boxed and sealed. The agents were polite, efficient, and methodical. Karen, for the first time, didn't scream. She just stood in her foyer, silent, gripping a coffee mug that read, "I run this place." Not anymore. The official charges would take a few days to process, but they were coming. Wire fraud. Invasion of privacy. Elder abuse, based on Royce's discovery that Karen had manipulated an elderly neighbor into signing over power of attorney, which she then used to access their accounts and transfer funds into the HOA discretionary budget. That was the final nail. But before she could be taken into custody, Karen made one last desperate move. She filed a civil lawsuit against me, claiming emotional distress and reputational damage. The lawsuit was hand-delivered in a manila envelope by the HOA's former treasurer, who looked deeply ashamed. Elijah opened the envelope and read it aloud at dinner. "She says you ruined her life," he said. I looked at him, then out the window toward Matthew's tree. "She picked the wrong family. We'd weathered the worst of it. But the storm wasn't done yet." Karen had always been delusional, but now she was wounded and cornered. The next battle wouldn't be in a meeting room. It would be in court. And I was ready. Karen showed up to court dressed like a substitute teacher who'd lost a fight with a clearance rack. She wore a beige skirt suit with shoulder pads that could have doubled as airbags and clutched a manila folder as though it contained the secrets of the universe. I almost laughed, not because of the outfit, but because she strutted into the courthouse with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real accountability. Her attorney, a man named Darrell who introduced himself as a sovereign legal strategist, clearly had no business being near a courtroom. He wore a BOLO tie, spoke in sentence fragments, and at one point referred to the United States government as the corporate entity formerly known as America. It was like watching two people try to out-crazy each other in front of a federal judge. Karen's civil lawsuit was as ridiculous as everything else she'd done. She claimed I had used my position to psychologically terrorize a law-abiding citizen, accused Elijah of militant behavior, and even tried to claim that her HOA role was equivalent to a federal appointment. Her filing was full of typos, odd capitalization, and used the word persecution 16 times. The judge, a seasoned woman with sharp eyes and no tolerance for nonsense, read through the document slowly before glancing over her glasses and saying, "Ms. Green, is this a prank?" Karen stood up, indignant. "Your Honor, I am the elected president of a sovereign neighborhood body. This woman brought federal interference into our community's spiritual core." The judge leaned back, clearly trying to stay professional. "You called the police on a child during a funeral. That's irrelevant," Karen snapped. I felt unsafe. He was holding metal. That was a flagpole. With sharp ends. The judge held up her hand. "Enough. We'll proceed, but I'm warning you, any more courtroom theatrics and I'll hold you in contempt." Karen sat down, muttering under her breath. Darrell leaned in and whispered something that made her nod like she'd just been handed a secret strategy. I suspected it was just nonsense, given that Darrell later tried to argue that HOA sovereignty exempted Karen from federal laws. When the judge asked him to cite precedent, he said, "The Founding Fathers wouldn't have wanted this," which didn't go over well. Then it was my turn. I stood, calm and focused, and laid out the facts. I explained how Karen had abused her position, weaponized neighborhood rules, violated privacy, and, most importantly, falsely accused my son during a sacred moment of mourning. I presented evidence, surveillance footage, financial reports, and a thick folder of victim statements from neighbors. But the moment that shifted everything came when Elijah took the stand. He wore a blazer 2 sizes too big and a quiet kind of dignity that silenced the entire room. He spoke clearly, without dramatics, about what it felt like to have the police called on him while saying goodbye to his brother. He described the fear, the humiliation, and how it haunted his dreams for weeks afterward. He said, "All I did was love my brother. She tried to make it look like a crime." You could feel the room tighten. Even the bailiff looked like he was blinking away something. Karen tried to object midway through Elijah's testimony, claiming it was emotionally manipulative. The judge stared her down and said, "He's talking about burying his brother. You're talking about flower arrangements and mailboxes. Sit down." From that point on, Karen spiraled. She interrupted repeatedly, claiming the court was biased and the legal system had been infiltrated by anti-HOA operatives. At one point, she tried to submit a printout of a conspiracy blog as evidence. The judge refused to even look at it. Her final move came during closing statements, when she stood up and tried to give what she called a citizen's declaration of rights. She began shouting about HOA independence and attempted to rip up a printed copy of the U.S. Constitution, an act that was both ironic and deeply confusing. She was immediately removed from the courtroom and fined for disorderly conduct. The judge didn't even need a recess. She ruled in my favor on the spot, dismissing Karen's lawsuit as frivolous and malicious. Not only that, but the court imposed sanctions on Karen for abusing the legal system and referred her for further criminal investigation. As the gavel came down, I saw Karen's expression flicker from outrage to something quieter: fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when someone realizes the rules they've bent for years are now closing in around them. But the consequences didn't stop there. The DOJ's official charges were filed that same afternoon. Karen was indicted on multiple counts, including wire fraud, unlawful surveillance, harassment, elder exploitation, and obstruction. The press got wind of it quickly. Within 24 hours, Karen went from HOA president of Oak Ridge Estates to suburban tyrant indicted by feds in headlines. Reporters camped out near her house. Former HOA board members resigned en masse. One even called me privately and said, "I'm sorry. We were scared of her. You did what none of us could." By the end of the week, the HOA was formally dissolved. With the board disbanded and its funds frozen, there was no one left to enforce Karen's fantasy rules. The neighborhood finally exhaled. Families removed Karen's decorative notices from their mailboxes. One man, who'd been fined every month for using a charcoal grill, hosted a block-wide barbecue in celebration. Lawn chairs spilled into driveways. Kids played basketball until dark. People laughed without looking over their shoulders. And as for Karen, she was arrested quietly, without fanfare, while trying to sneak out through the back gate of her property. She had packed 2 suitcases, a flash drive, and a coffee mug that read Queen of Order. Her mugshot hit the news by sunset. I didn't smile when I saw it, but I won't pretend I didn't feel satisfied. Elijah and I sat together that evening on the bench beneath Matthew's tree. The wind moved through the branches, rustling the leaves like a quiet applause. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. There was peace now. Real peace, not the fake kind written into HOA bylaws. Before we went inside, Elijah looked over at me and said, "She thought she owned this place." I nodded. But we never belonged to her. Karen's kingdom had fallen, not with a roar, but with a gavel, a truth, and a teenager who refused to be broken. The war was over. All that remained was justice, and maybe, if the neighborhood was lucky, a future without fear dressed in a cardigan. The news spread faster than spring weeds. Within 48 hours of her arrest, Karen Green's name was plastered across every major outlet from cable news to suburban mom blogs. Her face, once the self-appointed symbol of neighborhood decorum, now stared blankly from a mugshot that would become an internet meme before noon. Headlines ranged from serious to scathing. One called her the surveillance suburbanite, Another dubbed her the dictator of driveways, and one particularly bold article asked, "How many cameras does one HOA president need?" But no headline captured the sheer absurdity of what Karen had built and how spectacularly it had all collapsed. Though the court process would continue, the damage she had caused couldn't be undone overnight. Her invasive policies had left a scar on the community, a culture of suspicion, fear, and enforced conformity. For years, people had kept to themselves, afraid to plant the wrong flowers or host a birthday party without prior approval. But after her arrest, something in the neighborhood began to change. It was subtle at first. Porch lights stayed on a little longer at night, conversations between neighbors lingered more freely, and fences that had felt like barriers now looked more like boundaries. People were reclaiming their space. I received dozens of handwritten letters in the following week. Some came from neighbors I barely knew, others from residents who had moved away to escape Karen's grip. One letter, written by an elderly woman who had been too afraid to attend HOA meetings, thanked me for standing up to her. "You didn't just stop her," she wrote. "You reminded us we weren't crazy for wanting to live in peace." Elijah received letters too, most from other teens who had seen what happened and felt seen for the first time. One boy wrote, "You made me feel brave." But amid the small victories and signs of healing, there were still practical matters to address. The HOA's office, an ugly beige building that looked like a DMV with delusions of grandeur, was now vacant. With the organization dissolved and its assets seized, the property was auctioned off by the city. I decided, after a long conversation with Elijah, to buy it. Not for revenge. For purpose. We transformed the office into a public memorial garden, open to all residents, named in honor of Matthew. It wasn't flashy or overly designed. Just clean stone paths, quiet benches, and a circle of petunias that Elijah insisted on planting, remembering how much Karen used to hate them. We called it Matthew's Piece. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Where once HOA rules were drafted and fines were mailed out, now stood a place where people could grieve, reflect, or just sit without fear of a notice showing up on their doorstep. At the garden's dedication ceremony, the community showed up in full. Some brought flowers. Others brought old HOA notices, which they shredded ceremoniously into a compost bin near the entrance. A group of kids chalked messages onto the sidewalk. "Freedom lives here, thank you, Matthew, and no more Karens." Elijah gave a short speech, his voice shaking only once. He didn't talk about the day of the funeral, or the court, or the chaos. He talked about his brother. How Matthew once stayed up all night to help him build a treehouse, how he taught him to tie knots and sneak marshmallows before dinner. "He gave me courage," Elijah said. "And now I think I finally found a way to use it." After the ceremony, something unexpected happened. One of the former HOA board members, a woman named Lorraine who had resigned just before the investigation broke wide open, approached us. She carried a small envelope and looked 10 years older than when I last saw her. "This is from Karen," she said softly. "They let her send it from county. I thought about trashing it, but maybe you'll want to read it." The letter inside was exactly what I expected, and not at all what I expected. It was scrawled in purple ink, clearly written in haste, and opened with a line that read, "I still hate petunias." I almost laughed. The rest of it was a mixture of self-justification and bitter denial. She claimed she was misunderstood, that the community had turned on her unfairly, and that she was only ever trying to protect the neighborhood from decline. But buried between the excuses was one line that felt oddly genuine. "Maybe I mistook control for safety," she wrote. "Maybe I built a wall where I should have planted a garden." I folded the letter, tucked it into a folder labeled closure, and moved on. Karen's fate was sealed not long after. She was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison with no eligibility for early release. The judge cited her abuse of power, her manipulation of vulnerable individuals, and her lack of remorse. During the sentencing, she tried to give one final speech, but the judge shut her down. The courtroom was packed with residents who had been fined, surveilled, or silenced. When the verdict was read, there was no cheering, just a long, collective exhale. As months passed, the neighborhood continued to grow into itself again. The fear faded. The laughter returned. The lawns were no longer perfect, and no one cared. Someone painted their house bright yellow, and instead of a complaint, they received a basket of lemons from the neighbors. Kids rode their bikes through cul-de-sacs where Karen once installed quiet zone signs. Dogs barked freely. Barbecues smoked on weekends. The place was alive again. Elijah started volunteering with a local veterans group, giving talks about Matthew and the importance of honoring family and truth. He became a quiet force of light in the community, someone who had seen darkness but chose to plant flowers anyway. I continued my work in Washington, a little more grounded than before, a little more aware of how power, even in its smallest forms, can be wielded like a weapon or offered like a hand. We kept Matthew's peace open day and night. People came from other neighborhoods, other towns, just to sit beneath the tree or read the plaque that told the story, not just of Matthew, but of what happened when one community found the courage to stand up against tyranny disguised in pearls and HOA stationery. Sometimes, at sunset, I'd see Elijah sitting on the bench, eyes closed, listening to the wind. And I'd know that even though we lost a son, and nearly lost another to fear, we had won something too: our dignity, our peace, and our place in a world that finally knew who the real threat was. Karen tried to rule a neighborhood through fear. But in the end it was love, truth, and one boy's quiet resilience that tore her empire down brick by brick.